Would you like to know that? Just the white one, okay. I'd like to call the meeting to order. And do we have a, I think we do. I guess we don't really need a quorum since we're not taking any action, but so no quorum, and I guess we don't need to take roll. So the items we have on our agenda today is talk about the charter school facilities program and how we fund construction needs for charter schools in the existing program, and then to deal with modernization eligibility, and finally the project information worksheet, which we've talked about for quite a while. So with that, I'm going to ask staff to go ahead with the presentation.
Yeah, we'll turn it over to Ms. Kampminer, and she'll provide you the overview of the charter program.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon. The Charter School Facilities Program is designed to provide funding opportunities for charter schools to both construct new classrooms and or to rehabilitate existing district facilities that are at least 15 years old. Applications can be submitted by a charter school directly, or they can be submitted by a school district on behalf of a charter school. The Charter School Facility Program is a 50% state, 50% local matching share program, regardless of whether it's a new construction project or a rehabilitation project. One of the unique aspects of the program, though, is that the applicants have the opportunity to request the 50% local matching share in the form of a long-term loan from the state, and that comes initially from the bond funds and is repaid over a term of up to 30 years. The program design, the bond authority is limited, and there are a lot of applicants competing for the funds, so it's designed with competitive filing rounds, and the applicants that are successful are awarded a preliminary apportionment, which is a reservation of bond authority, and they have then 4 years to convert to a full funding application, and we'll go into that process in more detail in a few minutes. And they also have the possibility of a 1-year extension on that timeline if they request it from the board. But when the full funding application is submitted, it looks very similar to any other SFP new construction or modernization application, and it must meet all of the same requirements. The program history, the program itself was established in 2002 with Proposition 47, and initially $100 million was provided, and this was designed as a pilot program. In 2004, the program itself was revised in order to maximize the number of projects that were funded. An additional $300 million was made available in funding, and the program design was changed to cap the projects at certain thresholds so that the bond authority would be spread out amongst more projects. In Proposition 47, only 6 preliminary apportionments were awarded. That number went up to 28, I believe, in Proposition 55. There's actually a chart on page 4 of this section that shows the different preliminary apportionments that were provided with each proposition. In 2006, Proposition 1D came, and with that there were additional changes to the program, as well as another $500 million made available for this program. This time the program had some rather large changes. The funding caps that were placed in Proposition 55 were removed because applicants were having a difficult time converting their project within the limited bond authority that was made available per project with the Proposition 55 projects. The option of rehabilitating existing district facilities was brand new. This is the first time that came out in Proposition 1D. And the other major change was that new construction eligibility from the school district where the project is physically located was no longer automatically deducted based on the request that the charter school made for new construction funding. There was a different methodology that was proposed so that districts had a bit of a say in that process, and there was a certification process for that, and again we'll get into the details of that in a little bit. But overall there have been 81 preliminary apportionments made with the $900 million that has been made available to the Charter School Facilities Program, and it's been done through 4 different filing rounds. After the Proposition 1D authority was exhausted, there was funding that became available from Proposition 47 and then some leftover bond authority from 1D that allowed the State Allocation Board to open an additional filing round to exhaust that funding as well. And then also there have been other changes that have been made to the program through regulations and law over time to improve the process, such as statutory changes that allow charter schools to hold title to the facilities, and then the board has taken different actions and made changes to allow charter schools to participate equally with school districts and the new priority funding process and things like that. So with that, I'll get into the more detailed discussion about what a preliminary apportionment is and how a charter school or district requests for the charter school funding through the preliminary apportionment process. Is basically this program is designed so that there are two main components. There's the application process for the preliminary apportionment, and then there are the steps that are taken to take that preliminary apportionment to the full funding stage. So as I mentioned, the preliminary apportionment is a reservation of bond authority, and what this is it's a proposed project. It's a concept or an idea that the charter school or district has, that they have a school in mind that they would like to build. But oftentimes the charter schools are not in a position to go forward and design the plans and purchase the sites and start down this path without knowing that there's a guarantee of state funding in their future. So in order to make sure that there's adequate time for the planning with the assurance that there will be bond authority backing it, the preliminary apportionment is there. They provide the assurance so that the charter school is able to undertake this project. Now, when the preliminary apportionments are awarded, it is competitive, the funding is limited. Statute dictates that the preliminary apportionments that are made are representative of the various types of charter schools across the state of California. So when they're viewed as a whole, they are representative of different types, including different areas of the state, different sizes of charter schools, different grade levels. And then there are also areas in statute that determine what applications within the representative categories will receive different preference points. But before we even get to that step, the charter school or district needs to submit an application. Now, the application components are listed on page 5 of this item, and because some of them are unique, I will spend a little bit of time kind of walking through some of these pieces, because some of these things a typical school district would not need to submit when they're doing a new construction or modernization project. So the purpose of the items that are required in the application is to help determine an estimate of the grant that will be reserved for the project, and also to give general project information to OPSC to determine, to make sure that the charter school is requesting all of the grants that they could be eligible for, and just to get an idea of what the planned project should look like in the future. So it starts with the application for the preliminary apportionment, which is a Form 5009. This is similar to the funding application that a school district would submit for new construction or modernization funding, but it's not as detailed, because in the early stages the charter school is just coming forward with an idea. So there is also a narrative description of the project. That component, I believe, was added a couple rounds into the process, because OPSC was noticing that sometimes what folks were asking for on the application wasn't actually what they were envisioning their project to be. So the narrative description is an attempt to make sure that the state and the charter school both have the same vision of what this project looks like. So tell us a story, tell us what you want to build, and we'll make sure that you're asking for the right grants on the form also. The California Department of Education does a recommended site size letter that is based on the grade levels of the project and the number of students that will be served. And there needs to be a copy of the approved and valid charter petition. Now, the next pieces relate to the Charter School Facilities Program application for determining financial soundness. This is an application that goes to our sister agency in this program. It's the California School Finance Authority, and they have a role in determining the financial soundness of the charter schools that apply. So the application for that piece comes into OPSC, and it's then sent over to CSFA for further detailed review, along with the accompanying documents that have the financial documentation, legal status questionnaire, the things that CSFA would need to provide a recommendation of financial soundness. The next thing on here is evidence that the charter school delivered notification to the school district 30 days before they apply to the program, notifying the district that they're going to be requesting to participate in the program. The purpose of this is to give school districts a heads up that the charter school is going to be applying for funding, because school districts have a role to play in this process with the change in Proposition 1D, which has the districts helping to determine the number of pupil grants that may be offset from their new construction eligibility because of this charter school application. So this was an attempt for districts to know in advance so that they're not scrambling at the last minute to try to put this information together for charter schools. Now, if the charter school is a nonprofit entity, then they would also submit evidence of that status, and that comes into play in the preference points that are awarded for the project. And then for rehabilitation, there are a few other pieces that are needed if that's going to be an option. The charter school or the district would provide some drawings that show the interior dimensions of the rooms, and that's necessary because rehabilitation is funded on a square footage basis. And then we also require a signed agreement from the district and the charter school that basically lets the state know that both the district and the charter school have decided that this project is going to be acceptable and everybody is on board, so that when the preliminary apportionment comes, it's to a charter school that has a willing district that does have facilities available for this use. When the charter school is requesting funding for site acquisition for a new site or for adding on to an existing site, then we need an appraisal, and it can be a preliminary appraisal. Or if they're not at the stage where they know exactly what the site is going to be, they can pick a general location and do a median cost evaluation to see roughly what the per acre price is going to be, and then they determine, okay, we're going to do 5 acres multiplied by $500,000 an acre, and that's how much we'd like to be reserved at the time of the preliminary apportionment. And then there may be some Department of Toxic Substance Control cost documents available if a charter school is maybe a little bit further down the path in determining the site, or there can be an estimate applied if the charter school thinks that they might encounter some cleanup or testing, and they can apply that as well. And then if the charter school has data about the site and they know what some of the site development needs will be, they can also submit specific data on that. If they don't have that level of detail, then the program does have a mechanism to apply just a straight per acre rate to that as well. So the application process itself has quite a few components, but it's all designed to make sure that the proposed project ends up being a viable project, and that everybody has the same understanding of what's happening. Now on page 6, we go into a little more detail about the certification for the number of unhoused pupils. So I've mentioned that a few times, but when a charter school is applying for a new construction project, they are requesting a certain number of pupils. Let's say they're requesting 100 pupils. The school district where that project will physically be housed, in years past, before Proposition 1D changed the rules, that 100 pupils was automatically deducted from the district's baseline if the preliminary apportionment was successful. The school district had no say in what the impact of that project would be. The law changed that, and now what a school district does is they get the notification, the 30-day notification from the charter school, and they take a look at the planned project. And the charter school says, I have a project that's going to serve 100 pupils, and it's going to be in area B of your district. School district, how many of your unhoused pupils do you anticipate will attend this project? The school district then certifies to the number of pupils that might be, and it could be anywhere from 0 to 100. And the district provides a methodology for how they got to that number. So perhaps school district already has a school planned in Area B, and it's going to take care of all of their unhoused students. So the addition of that charter school project, in the school district's opinion, is not going to solve any of their unhoused student needs. So they might certify to 0 students. Whatever the school district certifies to, but using the methodology that they submit, is what the reduction will be from their new construction eligibility. So that's how the state avoids double funding students that would be housed by the charter school project, so we're not counting them from both the district and the charter school. One other thing, before the charter school or district applies for the program, they need to certify that they have considered district facilities that have been made available or that could be made available under Proposition 39, and that is a certification that's embedded in the application form itself, but districts and charter schools have to consider that factor before they apply to the program. So once all of those application documents are compiled, the charter school submits the application to OPSC, and this is done on a filing round basis, so it's only at certain time points when we have bond authority available when the board has declared a filing round. That is submitted, and then at the same time the financial soundness documentation is submitted, and the two agencies review the documentations concurrently. The preliminary apportionment grants are based on the application documents that have been submitted. Again, it's just an estimate or a best guess of what the eventual components of the project are going to be. One of the only things that can't really change is the pupil grant request, because that's tied into the in-house certification. So if a charter school requests 100 pupils, they cannot go over that number. But pretty much anything else on the application can change. You might think at the beginning you're going to build a multi-level facility. By the time you get there, maybe that piece goes away. The formula would change at full funding based on what the project looks like. So it's a reservation of funds. It includes many of the same types of grants that a new construction project or a modernization project might include. Might have small size project on there. There might be a geographic percentage factor applied to the project. All of those things are applied based on formulas. And then there are other things that are done based on the best information available at the time. The cost to acquire land, that's an estimate. That's going to change at the time that the full funding application comes in, but it's a best guess. And let's see, there's also an inflator factor that's added to these projects because the program is designed so that you have time to build the project. It can be assumed that there might be a change in the construction cost from year 1 to year 3 or year 4, whenever they're actually coming in for the final apportionment. So the inflator factor is added once all of the grants have been determined. And that inflator factor looks at the construction cost index over a certain period of years, and that would change each time a filing round was open. So it's not a set number, it's a set formula for how much extra authority you would reserve. The financial soundness requirement, again, that's done by the California School Finance Authority, and one of the things that they look at, amongst others, is that the charter school has to have been in operation and in good financial standing for 2 years or have equivalent managerial experience for that time frame to be considered financially sound. They do a more in-depth review of the charter school's finances, taking into account the size of the project and what the charter school is asking for, whether there's a loan component and the ability to repay the loan to the state over the term of the loan. The determinations are made on a pass-fail basis, and it's done at the authority's board meetings, and that information is communicated to OPSC before the preliminary apportionments are presented to the state allocation board. So those are the components of the funding application. Once that piece is done, would you like me to stop for questions there? Or
Yeah,
can I,
well, I have some
lot
questions I don't know that I think I'd like to ask now, but do you want to go first, some member?
Well, I have just a couple of general ones. First of all, if I'm the charter school and I have a 5-year lease with a school district and I come apply, I want to upgrade my campus, you're taking out eligibility out of the school district, potentially, for some of the formulations. What happens to that 5-year contract out? The school district says, well, we want that campus now, we got to transfer you someplace else. Does the charter school lose that building in the future if they get replaced to a new campus within the district? I mean, how's that work?
With the rehabilitation component, if they're using existing district facilities, there's a long-term commitment on the part of the school district. So the charter school really can't be kicked out of that facility once the district has committed to providing those facilities.
Even if they only have a certain year, I mean, I'm thinking one of my schools in my district, they only have a 5-year, a period to go. So someone like that, yeah, and I'm thinking on their behalf, okay, if they have to help fundraise or be on the hook for the loans of 50% of the money they want to get for there, it's hard to, does that, so the school district, if they were able to receive the funds, would have to commit a longer term with the charter school then?
They do commit with the longer term with the charter school,
Okay,
so it's
they're-
not the standard 5-year or year-to-year lease even. It's a longer term. It runs with the life of the project because if let's say the first charter school for some reason is no longer in existence, then the school district, because they've received bond authority to rehabilitate those facilities, the first priority for that campus would be to place another charter school in those facilities. So it's more of a long-term investment in that facility for charter school purposes. But there is a specific rehabilitation agreement that's done between the charter school and the school district that would address the term as well.
Another thing to highlight on in terms of the eligibility, the charter school enrollment, as long as the charter school is within the district boundaries, is included in the district's eligibility determination. So the charter school's enrollment is used by the district to project future enrollment. And that's consistent with all the charter schools that are within the district's boundaries.
That sounds good. And then I got a little component of the governor's proposed budget just got released this last week. And I just want to get your comments on the shifting of the charter school faculty grant program and the charter school revolving loan program from the Department of Education to the California School Finance Authority. Is that going to be consistent with the bond measures, or we're going to put this in, language? I mean, basically, I sound like if there's an appeal process, what way would it go on that as well?
Those two programs are not the programs that we administer. The ones that are being shifted from the Department of Education to the California School Finance Authority. So those are different
They're more
than this.
programmatic and not so much capital improvements then?
Yeah, they're capital, but they're not the ones that we administer. They're different.
So we have 3 different agencies that administer capital. We could just move on a couple more. I think that's it for right now. Thank you.
Okay, I have a couple. The California School Financing Authority is determining the ability of the charter school or entity to take on debt. If for some reason a charter school fails, okay, and it goes back into the district, who pays the debt?
There are some documents called the charter school agreements that we can get into in a little bit more detail. However, there's a commitment made between the charter school, the school district, and the state of California about the roles and responsibilities under the program. Now, the way the program works is if the first, let's say a charter school does fail and there is a loan remaining on that, then the school district has the opportunity to offer that. Well, the first step is that they would offer that to another charter school that can accept the loan on equal terms as the first charter school. So if charter school A is no longer there, charter school B can come in and accept the responsibility for the remaining payments. If there is no charter school that can do that, then the school district has a choice. They can either choose to use the facility for school district purposes, and if they decide to do that, then the school district would be responsible for making the remaining payments. If they don't need the facility, or if it doesn't suit their purposes for district needs, then they can dispose of the facility under the surplus property requirements.
And if they dispose of the property and the property is worth less than the loan amount, who is liable for that?
It's done. They pay back whatever proceeds they receive from
The school
surplus
district
property.
is liable.
No, they're not liable for anything above and beyond what they are able
So then
to
who
dispose
pays
for.
in this case, I mean, who pays the bondholders or the loan, the person who's holding the loan, who makes them whole?
The loan is from the bond authority, so it's basically just bond authority that does not come back to the state. So if there's $1 million difference, then the state program loses that $1 million if the surplus property sale does not generate enough to cover the balance of the loan.
The state,
This is only in the case of a charter school that has taken a loan from the state for their half. Right? So otherwise, it would be that we expended the funding, a charter comes forward with their 50%, they don't proceed, they've already paid their 50%, the state's paid its 50%, and then it's an asset. I thought it first went back to the state after the school district makes a determination on it.
In the event that the charter school is holding title, then
what happens when it's not a state loan?
It is a state loan in the program.
I know of a local example where the loan is not a state loan, it's a federal loan at 0% interest. So but it's still being administered, so who would repay that loan?
And it's under the charter school facilities program? Or?
Well, it's a charter school that's taken out a loan. I mean, assuming everything's fine, but if for some reason that school defaults, who's responsible there?
If it's connected to a charter school facilities program
Right.
project, then the...
Well, if it's connected to the charter school, it may not be a program that comes through the state allocations board.
First question, are they allowed in a financial soundness situation to actually borrow funds outside of the state school building program for their share? That would be the question.
Typically, that does not happen, and then the problem with that is that the state is in first position to receive any funds, so you have a hard time getting another lender
Well, I can go over
to
the
take
specifics
funds.
with you another time, but the general question is, and if you have a loan that's outside of the program, who pays it back? Does the student, if for some reason the school fails and the kid, I mean, there's an article on this in San Diego where the San Diego Unified has gotten stuck with some payments, but who in that case is responsible?
Outside of this program, I'm not sure that I have
Right.
the answer
Okay.
today. We could look
All right.
into it, but inside the program, there are protections so that the state is in first position for any funds coming back on this.
So then my next question ties in a little bit to some of the questions that Senator Hagman was asking. And maybe there are some philosophical questions that we can't answer here today, but when a charter school is open, it may not necessarily serve students in a specific school district. It could attract students from other areas, but the eligibility that you have or lose is tied to the school district in which the school is physically located, right?
Correct.
So, I mean, is counting those classrooms and students in that district, is that equitable in terms of another district doesn't have any, still has the buildings and I guess maybe has some of the enrollment counted against it, but I don't.
It would be when the school district is looking at their methodology for determining their eligibility adjustment, that would be a valid reason to say these 100 pupils are not going to serve any of my unhoused students because they're all coming from a different district. Therefore, my eligibility adjustment should be 0 because it's not serving any of my students. So we've actually seen that come through
So
on a prorated value.
Do they go to the other districts to say, 25% are coming from this district, and so we want eligibility from that district, or it's all
No,
tied?
the project can still go forward.
Well, I understand that, but I just didn't know if the situation where you deduct eligibility applies only to the district where the school is physically located, or if half the students are coming from the district next door, if you deal with, if that district has to give up any eligibility.
No, it's only the school district where the charter school is physically located, because that school district would be the one that would potentially have rights to the property in case of a charter defaults.
Is there any reason why, and maybe we ought to add this to the bin and issues to talk about, why we wouldn't subtract the charter school square footage or classrooms from the eligibility along with the students and keep each separate?
Subtract from the school district?
In other words, the charter school eligibility is based on the number of classrooms it has and the students it's serving, and the district will be based on the number of classrooms that it has in its traditional program and the students it's directly serving.
Well, I will just speak from and a comment on that is that this was a major sticking point between school districts and charter schools when this program began, as I recall, and that we looked at trying to solve that sticking point because it set charters and school districts into a bit of an adversarial. I'm taking eligibility from you, and we're moving it over here. So, and and districts had to provide, that was done automatically, I think, isn't it? And then we changed the law to say that could be self-certified by the school district. And I think it assuaged both charters and school districts' concerns around the unhoused pupils that were being utilized, and it gave greater flexibility to school districts. I think what you're saying is we need to really You're asking
Should we
whether
go one step further? I can see the self-certification because I don't want to I don't want to give up eligibility for students that don't reside in my attendance area. So
or students that they may be housing in the charter
Right.
school, but I don't consider unhoused. I have a spot for them
Right.
in my district,
yeah.
and I don't consider them unhoused, and they shouldn't be removed from my eligibility.
Yeah.
Correct?
Right.
Well, obviously, there's more to discuss. Are there any other questions? Okay, we'll move on.
Okay, so the next step then is to look at how the projects actually get funded, and this takes us to the preference points in the funding matrix. So I'm on page 7 of the item. And this is based on education code and outlined in the SFP regulations, but the projects must be representative of the various geographical regions of the state, urban, rural, and suburban regions, large, medium, and small charter schools, and the various grade levels of the pupils served by the applications. Now, within each, those are the main categories. Within each of these categories, then, preference is given to projects that relieve overcrowding, charter schools that have a high percentage of low-income students, not-for-profit charters, and charter schools that are using existing district facilities. So there's a total of 160 preference points that an application can receive, and it's 40 points per each category. With the nonprofit and the rehabilitation, it's a yes-no, you either are or you aren't, and you get 40 points or you get 0 points. The low-income percentage is based on the percentage of free and reduced lunch, either for the charter school itself, the district as a whole, or a school located within the general location where the charter school plans to build. And then the unhoused district pupils housed in the project, that's the measure of overcrowding that's being relieved, and that's a 0 to 40 point sliding scale as well. So if a district certifies that none of their unhoused students are going to be housed by the project, then basically the project's doing nothing to relieve overcrowding in the district, and it wouldn't get any preference points. And then depending on the certification, it goes from there. So once the points are totaled and the application itself gathers information to determine, is this a large charter school, that's based on the charter school's enrollment. Urban, rural, and suburban regions are determined by the National Center for Education Statistics data that uses census data to figure out what type of area it is. The regions, there's 4 regions in the state for purposes of this program, and that's broken down by counties and defined in regulations. And then the grade levels are broken into K6, 7, 8, and 9, 12, and it's based on the highest grade level that the project will serve. And what that results in is this green picture down below, which is the funding matrix. So what you'll see down there is that the project with the highest number of preference points may not be the first one funded. It's with the highest number of preference points within each category, because the main categories are the regions, the type of locale, the size of the school, and the grade levels. So then within those categories, that's when the preference points come into play. So if we're looking at category 1, which is region, there's 4 regions, region 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that's the third column over. The numbers in white are the funding order. So you first take the application with the highest preference points in region 1, then the application with the highest preference points in region 2, region 3, and region 4. So you don't look at any of the other factors except for region and the highest number of preference points. Once you're done with the region, you move on to the urban, rural, and suburban categories, and then the size of the school, and then the grade level. And you keep going down that matrix in that fashion until we're out of bond authority for the project. So that was a method that was designed to meet the education requirements, education code requirements, and to apply that fairly to everyone. Once that matrix is determined, then the applicants that are within the bond authority are presented to the State Allocation Board for preliminary apportionment approval. And we have had more applications than bond authority in all of the filing rounds that have been held so far.
I think we have a question.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment, and that is, maybe this is one of those that we put into the what are we going to do in the future. but it appears that the law was written to achieve certain objectives, and those objectives, it appears to me, is that to spread the funding throughout different regions of the state and throughout different types of communities, rural, suburban, urban. And how successful were we at that, I guess, would be my question. We don't have the data necessarily broken out in that way, but did it achieve that objective? And then in achieving that objective, is that what the charter schools, I'd love to be hearing from them, is that what the charter schools, charter community felt was a fair deal? And because it's very complex in how, it's very complex to administer, I think, for you all to administer this. And also, if I was a charter, you kind of throw your application in, and then it just depends, really, where you fall in these categories as to whether you are funded or not, which isn't very stable for them to be thinking about how they work their projects. So my question, I think, for us or for the legislature when they look at the charters again is, this was put in place for an objective. Was it met? Is it necessary in the future? And if not, is there a better way to actually apportion limited resources to charters? And I guess the best community to hear from about that would be the charter community. And if they can maybe, whether it's today or another day, address that, because it seems very complex.
I agree.
I'll make this one comment, though. At least it's very transparent. And I really appreciate that. When you look at districts who are large versus small, a lot of times they have a lot more resources to be focused on grants and those type of things, when smaller ones may not know things are available to them. So this is an attempt to distribute it across all those different lines. And I kind of like the attempt at it, whether it actually worked out the way it was planned or not. But we'll hear the report.
Yeah, I agree, except it is complex. And the question is what has created problems from districts participating, the fact that there's a difference in schools' ability to participate by region. And of course, there could be a higher concentration in some regions than others, or there are other barriers that create a problem, such as having to come up with the 50% match, having to borrow money to come up with the 50% match. We don't, most school districts don't go out and borrow money for their 50% match. They do with bonds, but not in the same way. So while it's transparent, we've also seen where we've had to extend rounds and other things to get the money out. So
we heard from the report that they haven't had a lack of applications to get the funding out, but we can also compare that side by side with our standard school grants and see how that's been distributed. How many school districts really have received money over the last 10 years? Have they all done it? Is it pretty equal to the number of students? I would say probably not. I would say the higher concentration has gone primarily to larger school districts who had the resources to go through the process and things like that too. So compare the apples and apples and see if it worked out. But some good reflection would be good.
I think that is, and I'm not necessarily saying that the objectives are not necessary. I'm just saying let's revisit them. Did we achieve the objectives? And if so, do they need to remain in law? And or if they're not, if they're a hindrance to the program funding? I'm just looking at that because it's how it's been operating because it sits in law. And there was obviously when the law was developed, there was a reasoning for that law to develop that way. I'm just saying we ought to revisit it again with no prejudice.
Yeah, and I think your point about having the charter schools come in and tell us would be good, because they're the ones that are impacted by this, as opposed to us sitting here and thinking streamlining and then causing conflict at the local level, because then they do have brethren going against brethren in terms of for limited resources and giving a bias towards one group or another. And so it'd be good to hear from charter schools at some point, not necessarily now, but later on, as this is further developed, what the pros and cons are.
Any other comments? Okay, we'll keep going.
Okay. So the next step after the preliminary apportionments have been made using the funding matrix is the process to convert to a full funding application. Again, they have 4 years with the option of a 1-year extension to convert to a full funding application. Now, the timeline, as you may remember from multiple board discussions, that stopped and started for several of our preliminary apportionment applicants based on the state's fiscal crisis. But as it's written, they have 4 years with the 1-year extension to convert to a full funding application. And the steps to convert have some unique aspects. One thing that's unique to the program is that the program is designed to provide advance funding for design purposes and for site acquisition. Sometimes the charter schools are not in a position to fund these upfront costs without participation from the state. So what they can do is come in and ask for a percentage of their preliminary apportionment early so that they can get started hiring an architect, designing the plans, submitting to the state agencies, and also acquiring a site. Now, to do that, they have to have certain things in place depending on what they're asking for. If they are asking for design requirements, then the funds for design requirements, then there are a few things that they need to do, but some of the steps are lengthier than others. They need to file a fund release authorization, the Form 5005, which is, that itself is a simple form. It just asks for the money. But before they can file that, they need to have current financial soundness from the California School Finance Authority. So if they've done it at preliminary apportionment and it's been a year and they're ready to come in for the design funds, then the financial soundness is evaluated again before that funding can be released. And they also have to have entered into the charter school agreements. And we touched on those briefly earlier, but basically those agreements outline what the responsibilities are with all parties and then the requirements for paying the funding back. Now, in addition to those things, if they are requesting for funding for site, they need to provide an updated 5009 form, which is the application form, which also asks, it potentially updates the cost for the site, but they need to have either a full or a preliminary appraisal for the site that they have in mind, and a contingent CDE site approval letter. So they need to have been working with CDE. They don't get all the way to having a final site approval letter, but they need to be working with CDE to make sure that that is a viable site that they're requesting the funding for. So once they have those things in place, they can ask for the funds. And for design, the advance fund release is equal to 10% of the total estimated project costs without including any of the site acquisition costs.
I was going to say, on bottom page 9, you have 20%, so is that a typo? This math doesn't work out one way or the other, so.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
800,000
That's
is 10%, so.
We flip back and forth, I apologize. It's 20% of the state share or 10% of the total. So
Okay.
if we're assuming that 10 million is the total cost, then that second line should read 10%.
And do we have this 10% maximum design cost on other state projects like high-speed rail and such?
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
10% is actually pretty.
So it is 10% of the total or 20% of the state share. Thank you for that clarification. So that amount is eligible to be released once they've submitted the appropriate documents, and then that's later offset from any final apportionment that they get. So it's not in addition to the preliminary apportionment. It draws down from the authority that's already been reserved for the project. And then the site acquisition request, that amount, that's determined with the preliminary apportionment request using the funding request, so that's either based on the estimated cost of the acreage in the area or based on a appraisal of a specific site they have in mind. So if they've reserved $5 million for the project, the advance release for site acquisition would be the straight $5 million. And then that number is refined later when the project converts to a full funding application, and if the costs have changed, then it's adjusted accordingly later on.
Just so I can be clear, I'm sorry to interrupt, Madam Chair. So basically, out of this $10 million project, the charter schools come up with their match at $10 million too, but they're getting the state money up front to do a lot of the pre-design work to acquire the land. But at some point, they're going to have to kick in their own money to actually finish the project, right? And they have to show some kind of proof or a letter, or they either have the money in the bank or they have an approved loan from the state for the other 10 million. They have to have some kind of process of that, right, to check on that?
Right, actually, that's a nice segue into the charter school agreements, but most of our applicants, and I don't have the exact percentage on hand, but most of our applicants take the loan from the state. So if they have a $10 million project, 10 million grant, 10 million is usually a loan from the state. So when we're providing the apportionment, we see that as a $20 million project.
So you look at the whole thing, make sure it's healthy before you get it.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the charter school agreements, it's potentially 3 documents. One of them is a funding agreement, and that's entered into between the applicant and the state. It outlines the amount of funds that are being borrowed. It sets the terms of the loan. Discusses the responsibilities when payment is due. So there are legal documents that the charter school has to sign before the state will release any funds. So before you get your design apportionment, you have to have entered into the memorandum of understanding and the funding agreement with the state, and then that's the legal document that allows the state to make good on the loan in the future. And then there is also a third piece of the charter school agreements, that it's the facilities use agreement. So in the event that the school district is holding title to the facilities, then the facilities use agreement is between the local school district and the charter school, and that outlines the rules for using the facility itself in the future, and who's going to be responsible for things like maintenance, and if there's going to be a fee, things like that. So those 3 documents have been developed by 2 of those documents, the Memorandum of Understanding and the Funding Agreement, which are the documents that the state is a party to, have been developed by the California School Finance Authority and adopted also by the State Allocation Board. So those are template documents. The details are filled in for each charter school depending on
And if a charter is getting, for example, 1D money, and there's LCP or audit requirements or whatever, they're still subject to the conditions of that bond,
Yes.
correct? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So again, template documents for the MOU and the funding agreement. The facilities use agreement, that format can look different depending on which school district and which charter school are entering into it. The state does review that to make sure that there's nothing in conflict with the program, but other than that, working out that agreement is left to the local decisions. So that brings us to financial soundness updates on page 11. Another requirement is that the applicant maintain financial soundness throughout this process. So financial soundness is done when the applicant is applying for a preliminary apportionment, at the time of any advanced fund release, and at the time of final apportionment. CSFA makes that determination, and each time the review is conducted, the determination is valid for 6 months. So if a preliminary apportionment determination is done and the charter school 1 month later comes in and asks for the design or the site funds, then they would not necessarily have to redo financial soundness, but if it's been a year or 2 years, then the financial soundness is updated. After the final apportionment stage, there are no further financial soundness determinations made. Basically, the rules then fall back over to the charter school agreements. And then the issue of who holds title. Historically, title of these facilities has been held by the school district where the project is physically located, regardless of the district's level of involvement. And this was a requirement until SB 592 came into place in 2010, and that allowed charter schools to submit a request to hold title. And the title can be held by either the charter school or the school district, or a local governmental entity was an option that was thrown in there as well. And what the charter school does is they submit a request to hold title, and they outline the reasons why title is not held by the local district or by a local governmental entity. And then they also agree to conditions that would be placed on the title if the charter school is the entity that will be holding it. And there are 3 conditions. There's a restrictive covenant, a remainder interest, and a lien. The restrictive covenant specifies that the facility will only be used for public school purposes as authorized in the Constitution and law. The remainder interest states that there's a remainder interest that is triggered when the charter school ceases to use the facilities for charter school purposes. And what this does is it passes title to the school district in which the facility is physically located, or if the district disclaims that interest, then it passes to the State Allocation Board. The other piece is a lien. A lien is recorded in favor of the State Allocation Board for the total amount of the bond funds allocated. That includes both the grant amount and any loan amount if it applies. So the final step in that is that if a charter school is requesting to hold title and has submitted the appropriate documents, they still need to go before the State Allocation Board, and the State Allocation Board makes a finding that determines whether or not the charter school has met the legal requirements to hold title. The board's not in a position of saying, yes, it's a good idea, or no, it's not, just whether or not they've met the requirements to do so.
Barbara, I do have a question. It's the chain of interest in the title is different than the chain of interest of outstanding loan obligations. So are you saying that in our program that either the charter holds title or the school district holds title or approved third entity holds title? And if the charter goes away, that the first course of that is that the school district then has title to that property. Is that correct? Or who's first after a charter goes away?
The school district is first after the charter goes away.
So if the title was held by the community services district, then that title reverts to the school district.
Yes.
I thought you said the school district has the option to bring that school into its.
They do. They do have the option to bring.
So they could say, our students are adequately housed. We do not elect to bring this facility into our school district.
I think it goes to them. By interest, it goes to them whether they want it
even
or
if
not.
it's not their original school.
And then they can. And then what happens after it? I mean, they're the first line, right?
They're first in line, but the requirement is that it's offered to another charter school to take it over on the same terms. Now, it's our understanding from legal that it goes to the school district first because it has to go somewhere once that first charter school has
Even if the
disappeared.
school district's not the chartering organization.
Even if the school district's not the chartering organization. So it goes to the district where the project is physically located. The district can, if the charter was holding title, the district can disclaim that interest. They have to actually notify the State Allocation Board that they don't want to hold title, and then it would go to the State Allocation Board. But if there's no notification, then it's going to go to that district where the project is physically located.
In essence, the school district has to, they either take it or they deny it. They don't have to take it.
They don't have to take it.
But they can notify you that they don't have an interest. I mean,
then we have it.
Then we have it, right, because it might be an office building that doesn't meet the requirements for, to go to the school district, correct?
It does have to
No.
go, if they qualify for funding, then they have to go through and have approval by DSA. So the buildings have to be up to the same standards as regular school districts. So it can't be just an office front. I mean, they can retrofit
For
it.
office, but yeah.
But they can retrofit it to be Field Act compliant. They have to be Field Act compliant, just like a school district would have.
And this is all theoretical so far because we've never had this situation happen.
Correct.
Correct. Have we had, in fact, have we had any charter that has not, that we have done a final apportionment on not proceed or to ownership of their project?
We have had one. It was before some of the protections and provisions were in place, so they received only, I believe, design funding from us, but they had a final apportionment but had not requested the fund release from us yet.
So we didn't invest in that.
$200,000, I think, and that was resolved. It's being still worked out, I believe, but so there was minimal, and there have been protections in place since then. Now there are no funds are released unless the agreements are in place. This was prior to that change in the regulations, but we've only had the one charter school that has gotten a final apportionment that has had any sort of funding associated with it that has not gone forward. We've had one other charter school that received a final apportionment, but they never accessed any type of funding from the state. So when their final apportionment, when they didn't submit their fund release request, then just all of the bond authority returned to the program and due to the time limit on fund release deadline. so they just weren't moving forward with their project. Nothing was ever built on that second one.
I had one other question. I don't know if it's appropriate here, or if you want to answer it when it is appropriate. Is I know that we had how you estimate what you reserved for those charter schools, and there was a healthy, as I recall, a healthy reserve in there that actually didn't follow with the project. I think you just kept it in OPSC or maybe it didn't follow the project. I can't recall. I would just be interested in, and if you don't have the information today, but over the course of it, did we do good estimating, and did that serve you well, or did we underestimate, or did we overestimate? And if we underestimated, we could have possibly done more projects. So how did that work out, I think, is what I want to know over the course of your work with charters, and could we improve on it to better serve them?
I think we can get back to you on that because we've just had a deadline for the Proposition 55 round hit, so we would have a better idea once we've processed some of those applications about what that looked like. So we could give you some information on that. I don't have a good guess at this point.
When you're able.
Yeah.
We keep talking about the safeguards, but you're saying that of all this 3 or 4 pots of money, we only had one project, and that was a very minor, not get fulfilled. So it sounds like the protections are pretty good in place right now, if that's their criteria. There's been enough people applying for the money, and we have any really disasters out there as far as projects.
Yeah, actually, we've had several charter schools that have been built. We've got a couple pictures in here. These are real schools that are funded under the program, not just ones that we've randomly found. So we have had some great successes. There have been some wonderful projects built. We have a lot of projects that have received preliminary apportionments that are still working through the process at this point, too, though. So we're still, with the fiscal crisis, it did interfere a bit with the timelines, so I think we're still kind of waiting to see how everything goes. But,
it also might be
customers.
appropriate at a certain time to hear, I know they're probably not prepared today, but to hear from the School Finance Authority. It's an unusual from all other programs, and Mr. Reyes and I sit on the School Finance Authority board as well with the state treasurer. They have a unique role in this program, and that is this financial soundness. And again, the evaluation from their perspective of how that's worked and how it's worked with you all. It might be that additional protection of the School Finance Authority indicating, yes, we've taken a look at their financials. They look solid as best as we know. I don't know if sitting on that board, I don't recall that anybody came forward that we didn't have a financial soundness. Some had to wait for their financial soundness just recently until they had another round of financials available. I'm not sure if we ever said, no, you cannot move forward, you're not financially sound. I think they were dissuaded perhaps from applying within that system, but it would be good to hear from the School Finance Authority on their role in the system, as it is their other, obviously the Department of Education, Department of General Services with the Division of State Architect, and the Department of Toxic Substance Control all have unique roles in this process that it would be beneficial to hear from their ideas around when we move into the idea stage.
Any other questions?
Okay.
Yeah. I have a question. How many schools have actually gone and received funding? Do you know right off the top?
Off the top of my head, I don't have that number handy, but we can certainly get that for you.
Okay.
There are quite a few schools that have a couple years left on their deadline to do that, but we can get you totals to date.
Okay. Thank you.
What I can get you is what I do know is for the first 2 rounds. With the 6 and Proposition 47, we had 2 that went from preliminary apportionment to final apportionment and accessed their funds. And in Proposition 55, we have 16 that have so far converted to a final apportionment, but some of those are still being processed, so they may not all have accessed their funds. And then there are some from the other 2 filing rounds, but those numbers I don't have for you today.
Barbara, did you say there were 81 that went for preliminary apportionments?
Yes.
So I think, what did you just say? So 18 and 2 that you know of so far that have been completed? So 20 projects completed?
That have received funding. I don't know that those are all completed.
But have gone to final apportionment?
Yeah, and that number's a little bit higher because I know we have some from the Proposition 1D round. I just don't have that off the top of my head.
I just have to clarify something. What we're saying is if a charter school participates in the state building program, right, they have to build to our standards. What happens to those schools who, I mean, maybe I should say office buildings, but there are charter schools who go out and find vacant, I know they're not in our program, but...
They can go to local jurisdictions, or some of them go to DSA, depends, but they can exercise either of those options.
Do we know what percentage of our charter schools fall into the two categories? I mean, clearly if the district has space available and is providing it, they're going to be in district facilities, but there are a number of charter schools that are not, and so then they're not participating. But if they do you require to bring the whole facility up to those standards? The part that you're taking on, what do you do there?
Well, at the district that I was at, we had 2 different charter schools that were in private facilities, leased warehouse spaces or spaces in office, business parks, converted them to charter schools. So you're subject to at the time it was the California Building Code, now it's the International Building Code.
Right.
And you can get there. We have over 900 charters. Correct me. I'm not
close to 1,000
right now. So in more than that, I'm sure the Charter Association knows. Is it 10,000? Is it
close to
1,065 charters now, of which 81 are in this system, of which 20 have gone to final apportionment.
So but what percentage are we saying fall into what I would call your traditional classrooms that are, would be eligible for the state building program? What percentage fall into using other spaces? Do you have any idea?
We don't have that information. Not sure if the association would, but we don't. We just track the ones that come in and apply for funding under our programs.
Okay.
Okay, so I think that brings us to the final step, which is the, the actual final apportionment. So once the charter school has obtained the necessary approvals from the state agency, well, let me back that up. Once they've actually designed the project, decided on the site, gotten the necessary approvals from DSA and from CDE and from if they need to do any sort of toxics work, done the cleanup, then they can come in with a funding request to convert their preliminary apportionment to a full funding application. And once it gets to this stage, the application components in the process are almost exactly the same as that for a school district that's submitting for new construction or modernization. So they even fall onto the regular form that the school districts would use to apply for funding. The exception being, of course, that they need to have that financial soundness determination done before the State Allocation Board makes a finding for final apportionment. And then the grants and the funding that's been reserved for them at the time of preliminary apportionment, this is where it gets adjusted so that it reflects what's actually designed and planned to be built. Now, the preliminary apportionment is an estimate, but that is the bond authority that's been reserved for the project. So if the project comes in and it would qualify for more funding than the preliminary apportionment, it's possible that that could be provided to the charter school, provided that the program has bond authority available. If there is no bond authority available in the program, then the charter school can choose to take the amount that is available, which should be no lower than their preliminary apportionment amount, or they can end up with some of the funds on a waiting list if authority returns to the program at a later date. However, the costs that are estimated, they need to be verified. So if we estimated that there's a certain amount for site acquisition available, then that needs to be followed up with an appraisal or an actual purchase price for the site. So everything's worked out so that they are receiving the funding that the final documents allow for. If there is excess money in the preliminary apportionment, so if we've reserved $10 million for the project and it's only justifying $8 million, then the balance, the extra $2 million, returns to the program to be used at a future date for other projects.
To use your $20 million example, the 10 and 10, would that be like 1,000 out of their loan and 1,000 out of the grant? So they're equally, so it comes out of each portion?
It comes out of each. It's a 50-50 program, so everything that results in the end is 50-50, including the design fund releases and the site acquisition fund releases. It's all straight down the middle, 50-50. And then just the final piece of that is that actual funding, again, is released by, actual funding release is offset by any of the advanced fund releases. So if you've gotten your design funds before and you've now submitted your final apportionment, when it comes time to receive the fund release for your final apportionment, you get the difference between your final apportionment amount and anything that the state's already released to you. And with that, we've got our picture here, and then on the attachment on page 13, we've got some of the grants, just to give you an example of the things that charter schools can ask for at the beginning. And other than that, I would be happy to answer any more questions.
Any more questions from members here? Are there any comments from the public on this portion of the agenda?
Just to answer a couple of the questions that came up. On the preference points, my inclination is to say due to the number of schools who haven't been able to access the money. Oh, sorry, Michelle Lowe with the Charter Schools Association. Is that because only 81 schools have been able to access this and take on that local matching share, my inclination is that the preference points didn't really come into play in it. However, we do have a working group on the schools who have actually come in through this program at CCSA right now, and I'm happy to ask them and talk to them about how that came into play and also run the data for you. And on the schools around California, that what kind of facilities they're in, again, that's data we're trying to get right now. We know a lot about our own members. Not all charter schools in California are our members, so we're doing a facility survey of the state right now to try and get a better idea of where charter schools are at and what kind of facilities they're in and what grants they're getting.
Okay. That would be all the data. The more data you can give us, the better.
We're trying.
For those of us who like data, but it certainly will help us with decision making.
I think one of the experiences that we had at the school district that I was at with the charter school project, we had a Prop 1D project. I would say that the program was cumbersome and difficult to navigate in many areas. One of the most difficult was reaching agreement between the charter school and the school district on the facilities use agreement. Oftentimes you're talking about setting parameters of use where you're 4 or 5 years in the future, and the relationship issues come into play somewhat between the charter school and the district, and they were okay in the district that we were in, but the number of agreements and the overall complexity of the program, it just made it difficult, I think, to perfect the application, just as an aside and reflecting on our experience at West Contra Costa when I was there.
And also on that note, charter schools don't necessarily have facility experts on their staff. A lot of time it's their executive director who is going through this application process, and the districts are the ones that have a facility staff. So to actually weed their way through the complicated process is difficult for them.
Well, I think to the extent you can have a good working relationship, it's better. I think part of our goal here is to streamline everything we can, and certainly the governor indicated in his proposal he'd like to see more streamlining. So I think that's a positive. And but when we come back and talk about this in more detail, it'd be great if you had more information for us.
I will bring back as much data as I can get for you.
Right, and any other feedback you have on, how the program's working would be great.
Definitely.
Great, thank you. Any other comments?
Hello, my name is Jim Bush. I'm with School Site Solutions. I I help a number of charters through this process, and I would like to echo Bill's comment about the use agreement, and maybe answer Assemblyman Hagman's issue about the 5-year agreement. The use agreement is a long-term 20, 30-year agreement that you have to reach in order to get the funding. So that 5-year agreement that you might be familiar with gets converted to a long-term agreement once you enter this program.
Does that preclude a newer charter school, let's say they're in year 3 or 4, from participating in a program like this if they can't show the facility they can secure is going to be there for 20 years, though? That's what I'm wondering. Is that cumbersome for the charter school?
Yes, it depends on the working relationship with the school district. I have represented a charter in the Sacramento area that had a good relationship with the school district, and they were going down the road to buy a piece of property and build a charter, and then there was a change of administration and they couldn't reach the use agreement even though the district purchased the property, and the charter had to go find another piece of property and ask the board for a title, approval to hold title, and all the expenditures on the first project, sequence, CD, and all those things, had to be eaten by the charter. But the use agreement is probably the single most difficult thing for a charter. I know of a large district in Southern California that it sometimes takes up to 2 years to get this use agreement through their process. So if there's some way to, in the early stage of this program, to identify the issues that a charter and a district need to agree upon and have them agree upon it before you get to the funding stage where then you can't agree upon it and you've already got an allocation, then that's a difficult situation, and a lot of charters are caught up in that.
Is there something that you would think, if someone's involved in our program, I mean, because, at least in a school, from a school district, can't be an everyday occurrence for every school board member and every superintendent. It's going to happen pretty rarely. Is there some guidelines, or you have certain criteria in order to approve for these dollars to come down there? Is it like, here's a use agreement that you have to use as well? Is that something we even want to consider to help take that back and forth when there is no really guidelines on that agreement? If, say, we agree to use this school site, here's the standard use agreement that everyone has to work with. I don't know.
We had joint use agreements with the cities or the counties that overlapped with our school district boundaries, and just relatively simple joint use agreements on things like gyms and swimming pools. Some of them took us a year to a year and a half to write. Bill's nodding his head. So it's not, it seems it's not as easy to do, and I agree that you need to streamline it. And, having been on the board and knowing people who are currently on boards, you get into, we need, some kind of assurance that they're there to act in the best interest of the district's kids, but also to manage the district's money. And that's one of the reasons I was asking some of the financial questions earlier, because I think if you remove financial liability from the district, even though we haven't had a problem yet, but as the program grows, you also potentially increase the probability that, a charter may not be successful. But I think to the extent you can work that out for a district so that it has assurances that it's not going to end up taking over a school along with debt or whatever, and we can work some of that, it's going to be easier to work through the joint use agreements.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Any other testimony? So we're going to move on to modernization then.
And Ms. Tracy Sharp will be presenting that.
All right.
Hello, everyone. So I'll be speaking to the modernization program today. previous meeting, we did a quick overview of the MOD program, and today we're going to focus on the eligibility of the modernization program. So the modernization program provides funding to renovate, modernize, or replace existing school buildings. Funding is based on a per pupil grant amount, and it's site-specific, different than new construction eligibility. It's eligibility is established at a particular site, and funding then is focused on that one site. So when we establish modernization eligibility, we're basically focusing on a comparison of the enrollment to the eligible buildings on the site. And eligible buildings are permanent buildings, either 25 years old, or portable buildings that are 20 years old. And so the big question for a district establishing eligibility is how many pupil grants are going to be established by an individual site. So today we'll focus on looking at how we establish modernization eligibility, look at a couple of examples of options for how you would establish adjustments once it's been established, and some other considerations, especially additional funding that's available for those buildings that are 50 years old or older. So one of the things I mentioned was the age of the building. For portable buildings, you'll see a picture there on page 15 under the 20 of a common portable building, and the age of that building is determined by looking at the date that the plans for that building were approved by DSA, adding 12 months, and then 20 years after that 12-month date is when that building becomes eligible. And then the same logic applies for permanent buildings, only it's 25 years. Now, if the building has received state funding from, say, the lease purchase program, that 20 and 25 years is going to start from the date of apportionment that they received funding for that. So the first step, if I'm a district, for establishing modernization eligibility is to take an inventory of my site. I'm going to look at all the eligible school buildings on that site and create a list of what's called our gross classroom inventory of the site. So the gross classroom inventory is going to include all the buildings on the site, their year that they were built, which I described earlier, their use, whether it's a classroom or other type of facility, the grade level, and then, of course, whether it's permanent or portable. We get some assistance for consistency's sake from the Education Code and state, or the school facility program regulations with defining what a classroom is and what a portable is, or a permanent classroom as well. And so that helps us with ensuring consistency in our gross classroom inventory count. If I can point you to the diagram on page 17, we have a potential school site, OPSC Elementary. As of January 2013, we've got some 5 K-6 classrooms there that are all permanent based on their age. They're 33 years old, and a couple of portable, and a library, and a multi-purpose room and admin space. Based on their age, we've color-coded them, the yellow one, for the eligible buildings, because these permanent buildings here are 33 years old, the portable is 22, and the library is not yet eligible because it's only 22 years. And the multi-purpose room is only 4 years old, so it's not yet eligible. So for the purposes of the gross classroom inventory, all of that information is needed to help us establish the baseline eligibility.
So I understand this, I'm sorry. In the previous page, you have a lot of square footage stuff, not in excess of 2,000 square feet, this and that. How's the square feet fit into your equation? It sounds like it's just by age, right?
It's by age, but when we are calculating the actual eligibility, when I get into the 2 options for determining the eligibility, we're going to use that square footage as one of our options for calculating it.
Thank you.
Yes. But that actually is a good question. I missed pointing out something there. And this is a difference between the modernization program and the new construction program, in that classroom in the middle there, the permanent classroom that's only 650 square feet, for the purpose of new construction, we would not count that as capacity in the district. For the purposes of modernization on this site, it would be counted as space that could count towards their eligible classrooms, even though it's less than 700 square feet.
So just clarifying, in this situation, this school would potentially be eligible for both modernization and new construction dollars because of the 650 square foot classroom, assuming they haven't taken that eligibility and spent it elsewhere in the district, correct?
For new construction, it's district-wide, but yeah, as long as you have a classroom that's greater than 700 square feet, they're eligible. That would be the gross, and that's what we're looking for modernization. We look at the gross, all the classrooms that are eligible. Now, for new construction, we then take a look at some, which ones are excluded and get to the net, and we do that on a district-wide basis.
Right.
On this example, this is on a site basis for modernization, so to be able to determine whether they're eligible for new construction, it would be using this information along with all of the other schools' information. So just based on the information on this site, we wouldn't be able to know whether they qualify for new construction.
Potentially they could
That's correct.
take new construction dollars and if they wanted to replace the small classroom, they potentially could qualify for new construction if they hadn't used eligibility elsewhere, if they had it available.
Okay, so the details here of, as we said, the square footage and number of classrooms and those that are eligible are going to go into our calculation for determining how much modernization eligibility, number of pupil grants, are going to be generated at this site. So we typically have, or there are, two ways of looking at that. We can look at the total square footage on the site and compare eligible space to total space, or we can look at our classroom count ratio. So the first one, option A, looks at the classroom count of what's actually eligible, and it compares the capacity of our eligible classrooms, and when I say eligible classrooms, those that are either 20 or 25 years or more, to the actual enrollment. And so if we're using that same diagram, if we flip to the next page, the second chart there compares our sample enrollment for the site. Right now it's for K-6, the enrollment is 150, and severe it's 8. And on our site we determined that we had 6 eligible classrooms. 5 of them were K-6 classrooms, and the state loading standard is 25, so that's 125. And 1 severe classroom is of age, it's eligible, and the loading standard is 9. So we compare those two, and the lesser of the two is the baseline eligibility for that site. So 125 K-6 pupil grants and 8 severe pupil grants. That's using the number of classrooms eligible on the site to determine their eligibility. And enrollment is basically taken from the CDE database, the California Basic Educational Data System. When I use the term enrollment, and in other places you might see CBEDs, we're talking about the same thing. So that is what we commonly refer to as option A, and it is one of the most common ways of determining eligibility and is often the most beneficial to the district. So the other option is using a ratio method that we refer to as option B, and it's comparing the eligible square footage to the total square footage, or you could apply a classroom count, use classroom count in this ratio. And that's our next example on page 19 here. We've looked at the total eligible square footage divided by the total square feet on the site, and we come up with the percentage of 59%. And the second step is to apply that to the CBEDs or enrollment at the site to determine the final eligibility. And in this case, 59% times 150, rounded up, it's 89 for K-6 and 5 for severe. So in using that same diagram, we would encourage districts to do this and do it with districts as we're establishing eligibility with them. We would be able to show easily that option A in this case is more beneficial to the district in generating their eligibility.
Option B generally helps a school site when you have large non-classroom area, like a multi-purpose, a library. Right. You have these buildings that are older, they qualify, but they're not classrooms. So those are the types of sites that would generally benefit from option B.
Okay. And the next section there is a cap on enrollment. Basically, we looked at the comparison. It's always the lesser of the two, that a site couldn't generate more eligibility than there is enrollment at the site. But on the flip side of that, if in our example there on the prior page, their enrollment was not 150, it was only 100 at the time they came in and established, and that would be their baseline would be 100. In a future year, if their their enrollment increased, they could submit a new form and get it updated to add those additional pupils and increase it to the full 125.
In your diagram, let's say you have 5 classrooms there. Let's say you had only enough students for 3. You're talking 100 students. Mm-hmm. And they come in and say, we need to modernize classrooms. But they're all in the same complex, the same building stretch. So you're saying we would go ahead and let them do projects on 3 of them, but leave the 4th and 5th untouched because they don't have the students for it. Even if they show the 5-year plan, they're going to be having kids there or something? Or this seems like very inefficient.
Right.
Versus doing one contract for all of it.
You could use them instead of temporary housing.
It would be, the difference would be that this would establish the eligibility, and that's the discussion today. Actually doing the project, you would obviously, you would do all the classrooms together as a district and use local funds to make up what you needed to do them in an efficient manner at the time you were doing it.
But I think
you
what
have to have local funds then.
I think what Senator Hagman's saying, if you can't afford to do that, then you go out with one contract to modernize half your classrooms, and then later on, when your enrollment increases, you go out with another, in which case you're duplicating.
I think, though, in your case, that building is touched. It was used to generate eligibility, and therefore it is considered modernized in the state's viewpoint, right? Isn't it?
They would. Right now we're talking about the eligibility. So let's just say, if we go back to page 18, that the district qualifies for 125 pupil grants on the K-6 and 8 severe pupil grants. Mm-hmm. Once a district has that eligibility, how they use it, and again, this is per pupil grant amounts, they can use that amount on the buildings that generate the eligibility or in other facilities. So this equates to a certain dollar figure, and they can use that. The district has the flexibility to use that dollar amount anywhere on that site whenever they choose to do so. So once this eligibility is established, then they can use that eligibility, the grants in the site on any of the buildings.
But that which generates the eligibility is then considered modernized. The 6,000, in this case, on your step 1, your 6,450 square feet is considered modernized.
We use the older buildings to generate the eligibility. Once a project comes in, depending on which projects get modernized, then those are the ones that are the ones that get upgraded. But in terms of the ages of the buildings to generate, sorry, let me take a step back. You're correct. Those buildings are the ones that are considered modernized because they're older buildings.
And
simple.
I think we had a discussion about this earlier. We would like to, at least for me, and I don't think it's abuse out there too much, but if I was a school district and I took that money and I built a new football stadium down the road and didn't touch those classrooms, those students are now still in the old building that we, as the state, said you apply for modernization at this point, or if I did 3 out of the 5 buildings, it's not going to look, I mean, there's got to be a better way of doing it. It seems a little more efficient, and that you're getting the money for the project that you applied
Then
for.
they come back later and say, we've got a problem with.
Yeah, and I get a emergency grant because the roof's falling.
Look at it another way, if you would. You get your eligibility from your classrooms, and you're taking an old campus. Many districts have to spend that money on just upgrading the site infrastructure. So the electrical service is 40 years old. That has to be done. Or a lot of this, and so you don't get to use all of your money directly on the classrooms that generate it because you have needs throughout the campus. And so that's what the local district makes that decision in terms of using the funds correctly
You're
to
hopefully also
modernize their facilities.
using matching funds for that.
Right, and districts are also putting a lot more.
But I think what Senator Hagman's pointing out is having some assurance that the money you get goes to modernize those buildings that are eligible and doesn't get used for other purposes. So
Now, I want to get the flexibility with the districts. Don't get me wrong. I'm just trying to. We also hear the ones about the roofs falling in, or it's just so bad it's uninhabitable.
Sure.
And if some previous board mismanaged or did not, I mean, we're not putting enough money in for maintenance. There's a whole bunch of issues with this. But there's got to be some flexibility when you look at that plan, saying, okay, you qualify for this dollars, or maybe we need to rethink this for 2000, the next bond, and say, okay, with this dollars, you need enough to actually revive this campus. I mean, we do have a point where 50% is too much. We say tear it down and start over. So if you use your scenario and it's going to all this infrastructure inside and the buildings aren't touched, are we getting to that threshold? Are we really looking at a holistic view at this campus and saying it's worth revitalizing with the limited amount of resources, even with the school district match? Or is it time to rebuild? You know, that bigger picture look is something that you may want to look at, versus spending more and more money after that and not get what you really are bargaining for. If you're saying, I'm going to rehab these classrooms, but it's really not going to the classrooms, I think there's an issue there.
I guess what I would like to put on our to think about list is that, let's take your special day class here. It has 8 students, but we use a loading factor of 9. And anyone who's been in a district knows you might have 7 students one year and 10 another, depending on what the load is, but that could vary. The fact that and most special day classes actually are larger than your 960 square feet, but some are.
Definitely.
But I'm getting grants for, in this case, 8 students, but let's say I get it for the maximum of 9 students. It may cost me as much to modernize that classroom, even though there's only 9 students, as it does the one next door that has, that's just a regular classroom. And so when we take a look at how we establish eligibility and give grants, it seems to me that the grants should be based on the loading factor, but should also be realistic. I mean, if I only have 23 kids in a classroom this year instead of 25 or whatever, I mean, you still have to, it still costs you the same amount of money. And so I don't know how we make that work better, but we need to do that.
I have as long as we're putting the ideas out there. In looking at the modernization and the eligibility, in my mind, it has the greatest disconnect between what is actual and what is necessary and what is calculated. So if we're going to take a look at a new program, in modernization, we generate an eligibility number and we give a dollar value. So that's a state cap on what they're investing in that school. It has nothing to do with what actually might need to happen. And if there are buildings that have been well maintained over time and their modernization needs may be less, or there's buildings that they've been maintained just fine, but their systems are necessary to be replaced, let alone what I believe has never been addressed in this program, and that is modernization or rehabilitation to bring that building into 21st century learning standards. So I think that if we're going to look at the new program, we have a calculation based upon students. perhaps there is a better way to look at, and that is, what is the actual cost to modernize there? And it's usually, there's systems ways to look at that. And if the state wants to cap what it's going to invest in that, they cap what they invest in it. There's an artificial cap done now, but it just is so divorced from the reality on the ground of what is necessary.
Well, if you remember when we had the federal guys coming in for the federal campus schools, they actually had a list of criteria. It wasn't based on dollar amount. It was like, this is what we considered a minimum classroom, whatever those standards are. Mm-hmm. And maybe what we decide, instead of formula fed, we say this is the minimum what you have to upgrade to, but our cap is 50%, whatever the case may be. That way, if it's a, I still like to talk about the whole maintenance factor, and the school district should be maintain their own buildings a lot better than they're doing. But if you have that standard it goes to, and then they come up with the business plan that they come up with and saying it's going to cost us X amount for these buildings to bring them up to that level, okay, we're in for whatever percentage. We're in for 50%. It could be minor on some campuses, it could be major in others. But now you're at the end result, when you're finally done, you have classrooms that are a certain standard that you could be pleased with the outcome of, and it may not be exactly the number thing.
This is going to be a robust conversation when we do have it. When the state building program was changed, it was changed in a way to try and simplify it. So we give schools grant money, and we allow them to make the educational and the other decisions. And if you don't want any overhang, fine. If you want a 6-foot overhang, if you want a 2,500 square foot multi-use room, if you want a 5,000, whatever, we try to give them the responsibility and the authority to make those decisions. I don't know what a 21st century school is. I've seen a lot of trends. I mean, in our school district, the schools that we ended up replacing were the open classroom schools that were, maybe they were a late 20th century trend. I don't know. But school boards made decisions based on what they believed their school should be, how they should be built, and based on their community standards. And I don't think the state, and I think the governor was sort of signaling to us, is ever going to be in a position of telling schools, school boards or communities what they should be building. I think, we really want to be a partner there. And if we're going to get into questions of, is this educationally, is it adequate or not adequate, your board made a decision to build this. I mean, we had a building we tore down that was a concrete building that was a disaster, just a disaster, and anyone who walked in and said, who could have been thinking, what were they thinking? But I don't think the state should have, because it no longer meets educational needs. I'm not sure it's the state should have to step in and replace it when the local community made that decision and when they've got to take some responsibility there. But I do think, when we get into eligibility, like I said, I'll give my example with the special day class and the traditional classroom. One, you're going to give 9 grants. The other one, you're going to give 25. The square footage is the same, and it's going to cost the same dollars. So there has to be some reasonableness test. If you go in and you modernize, but I don't modernize one classroom because right now enrollment's down, in 5 years it's up, that doesn't make sense either. So I think we're going to have some robust conversations on all this, but ultimately part of that conversation has got to be, to what extent do we want to be a partner and allow those people who are elected to make the decisions about their schools, and I don't want to reward someone who decides not to maintain them either, and to what extent are we going to try and direct what's actually the decisions that are made.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I wasn't thinking architecturally, more as health and safety reasons. If you don't have the adequate wiring in there because it's a 60-year-old building, you don't have fire escape routes, and the amount of money we give them just doesn't get to that point, maybe we should consider do something else there.
Yeah.
As far as what the desks look like or how much overhang, no, I don't think we have any say, nor do we care. But is it safe? Is it enough to get those buildings up to the standard building codes at this time, and the certain things we need? That's something, if it's not enough money, that we should look at.
And we can have, I think it will be a robust discussion, and there are many ways to approach the issue. And if we kept simply with with how we do things now and want to take a look at that, I think that we ought to go back then to the per grant, per student amount. And as I understand, when we created that amount, it was put into statute, but it came from a place of being a percentage of the building.
Right.
And I guess then let's look at that, because again, that may have nothing to do at this day and stage for modernization. It is what you could have done, a percentage of a new construction building, right. But it really doesn't have the reality of what we need to do in the state around modernization. And I think we ought to look at that. Then if the state wants to cap its participation, it caps its participation, and that'll be another discussion, I think, of our legislature. But really, the current system as we set it up didn't really look closely, I think, at modernization and what the needs were. I think we built it off of a new construction program where we were in a very robust time with new construction and needed that, and this was how it got built. And I think we ought to look at the fundamentals of those numbers to say, how does it serve us today? And are we improving systems? Are we improving education? And if the flexibility is built in there, then the outcome ought to be the standard. And is the outcome we've left, that building is better, and it's better for the next 25 years than it was. However you approach that. And I think there are really important discussions around modernization, because we have 10,000 schools in California.
I think we're on the same page. I think we've talked about, also what kind of, Mr. Hegman brings up all the time, and I second it, what kind of new construction we want to incentivize. I mean, when you take a look at the very first picture in this section, when we give the same grant amount to bring on wheel-on portables as we do for new permanent construction, and then you're having to pay for modernization 20 years later instead of 25 years later, I think, we're going to have to take a look at all of it.
Well, including, I think, portables. We are putting modernization money towards portables. And is that a good expenditure of funds? And I guess, we've done it. How many, and because of local flexibility, you could have generated the money you could have generated your grant for the portable, but you didn't spend it there. But really, what kind of conditions are we leaving students in once there has been modernization done? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't modernize portables, but I'd like to see the analysis about, is that a good expenditure of state funds?
I think a lot of districts, Bill, your district and my district, we ended up using more local dollars to take our modernization funds and actually replace portables. So, but again, that's another discussion to say.
The resource discussion.
That's right. And it's a resource discussion of what are your local decisions and what are your state decisions there.
And I'm going to throw out something. We talk about this on the edges, but education is so different than the rest of the business world. It seems like we reward failure all the time. If your school does worse, we throw more money at it. If it's broken down, we throw more money at it. And we want to encourage people to be on school lunch programs because we get more eligibility. It seems like we always focus on the negative. And one of the things we're looking at on this board is always keeping your investment that we put money into up to speed. If there's any way that we can maybe start a discussion of rewarding those school districts who do take the resources and time to maintain their facilities, and not always reward the ones that don't. And I don't know how to change that climate, but it seems like we always we're always throwing bigger money in the ones who actually manage their campuses a little bit better because they put a little more money toward it, or they actually use their 2% or 3%, where we were making them do lately, to do capital improvements versus slapping a new piece of paint on it. We got to change that climate. And that's my biggest thing generally is it seems like we always throw more resources after the people and it almost incentivizes them to do or report failure. So I don't know how you just start the discussion either, but.
Well, when we've been looking at future agendas, at the point where I don't feel compelled to have to finish by a specific date, because we know assuming we can all agree that we need a bond, we won't be determining what that bond looks like until 2014. So I do think, we're planning to have the UC folks come in and present, and I think we need to talk about a lot of this, because the problem is, where do districts get enough money to adequately maintain? The problem comes in new construction. We got to talk about life cycle management. There's all these things that I think are at least worth talking about to figure out how do we give school districts, communities tools. Because if I pass a $500,000 bond or $500 million bond, and if you fix up all your schools, then you don't have money to maintain them, then you're not protecting the taxpayer investment. So I think they're good issues to talk about. We may not have the answers, but at least I think we should at least begin the discussion. So I guess it's a little bit longer. To keep moving on modernization.
Okay.
She's just started, too.
Right.
Oh, no, this is actually quick. Okay, so we spoke about briefly the establishing the baseline. Now, districts do have an opportunity to make changes over time. Those are the adjustments there on page 20. They can adjust for increases in enrollment and add to it, as we mentioned. Additional buildings, when they come of age, they can submit an adjustment that will increase potentially their eligibility. Now, should their enrollment go down, we do not adjust for enrollment going down as we would in a CBEDS adjustment, say in new construction. It doesn't happen in modernization. More typical decreases are going to be when they draw on their eligibility to actually fund a project. Now, the other considerations under MOD that we'd like to speak to is when there are buildings that are 50 years old or older. There is an increase to the funding, the pure pupil grant amount, when you have buildings that are 50 years old or older. And in this case, we have an example of how that plays out, because it's not more pupil grants, it's an increased individual pupil grant. So, for example, we've looked at a site that's got 20 eligible classrooms, and we'll say they're K-6, because the loading standard is 25. The capacity on the site is 500, and the enrollment at the site is 500. So they have a baseline of 500 pupil grants. Well, on that site, some of those classrooms are 50 years old or older. And there's 5 of the 20 that are 50 years old or older. So we look at it and say, what's the ratio of buildings generating eligibility that are 50 years old or older? And it's 25%. So if you look at step 3 of that on the next page, of those 500 pupil grants of eligibility they have on their baseline, 125 of them can receive an increased grant amount. And where we see this is when the district comes in and actually submits a funding application. They still only have 500 to request, but there's going to be an increase. And just quickly, I jotted down what that increase looks like. If it's a K-6 pupil grant, the increase is going to be $1,400 per pupil grant. And for severe, if it's a severe classroom or pupil grant, that increase is going to be $7,442. So there's a substantial increase for the additional work, more extensive work that might be required on a 50-year-old building. And so we ran some numbers on the number of applications where 50-year-old grants were requested over the life of the SFP, and as of December, there were 16% of MOD applications included a request for 50-year-old building, and that's based on 6,341 applications.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is that, so you would have had to, though, not have modernized a 50-year-old building in some 25-year cycle, correct? So we are, or is that correct?
Mm-hmm. As long as it wasn't touched with LPP funds.
Right. So it's, when we began this 12 years ago, 13 years ago, it was those buildings that were 50 years old that had not had state investments in that were eligible for this.
Right.
And you're saying of the over 6,000 projects that we did as a state, 16% of those had that or availed themselves of that funding.
Right. There could be others that didn't tap into that eligibility, yes, that's possible, but we looked at those that did.
Do we know what the average age was of the classroom that's modernized?
I don't think we keep track of that. Yeah.
No.
I don't think we would have that data.
Something we can try and take a look at, but
I have a question too, and so you went over your when is a building considered modernized? So a local entity could do any project on their buildings. It's only when the state project has come in that we consider the building modernized. Is that correct?
that's correct. As long as a district awards contracts after 1998, they can do work on their own, and they come back in and get reimbursed from the state for that modernization work. So,
well, I'm asking it a little bit differently then. I have a building. It's 30 years old. I went in and did the wiring a couple of years ago. I actually want to come into you and to you, not you, to us collectively, to come into the state and get funding for modernization. It's not considered modernized because I've touched it with my own funds. Correct? It's eligible,
correct.
And I can use the funding however, as we talked about here, however I need to use it. I could have spent a lot of money there, and still, until the state touches the project, it's not considered modernized. Is that correct?
yeah, and we get into some details here. The extent of the work, as long as you don't replace the building, may be a factor. But typical modernization upgrades, that kind of thing, if it is done at the local level, it shouldn't affect their eligibility for the program.
Okay, thanks.
It seems like we need to not confuse what it means for a building to be modernized and what it means for a building to be eligible for modernization funds, right? Regardless of the amount of work that is put into it in the program or not in the program, the question is whether it's not whether it's considered modernized, but whether it's still eligible for funding, right?
Correct.
That's
Yes.
That's a better way to put it,
Yeah.
yes.
So there is an allowance in statute for a second round of modernization if the building reaches their 20 or 25 years old age within the modernization program. And as well, if it's a closed school site, say a district comes in and their site is closed, but they want to reopen it, they can establish modernization eligibility, and as long as they are going to use it for at least the next 5 years, we can establish modernization eligibility there. And because they don't have current enrollment, we can't go to the SAB system, we're going to look at their demographic data and see what their projected enrollment would be at that site to help us determine what their baseline eligibility is going to be.
And when you have a definition of closed site, A, how long does it have to be closed, and B, if the school district's doing other activities, let's say they move their administration there, they're subleasing it out to a private entity for a year or two, what's considered a closed site?
Any of those things can happen, and the biggest issue with bringing closed sites back into the program has to do with if there were any changes made to the building that were not Field Act compliant or done through DSA. There are many districts that get caught in this tangle of leasing to a private school, for example, where they make changes, and they have to go back and try and reestablish their Field Act compliance with DSA. That's really the most fundamental issue.
So that doesn't affect eligibility, it just affects the work that needs to be
Just their ability to
done.
do the work in a cost-effective fashion.
But if I close it down for the summer period and say I physically close the site down and then open it up next enrollment cycle, as I count, then no.
No.
Okay. If there aren't any other questions on the eligibility side, I'm going to turn it over to Brian O'Dell to walk through some of the data on the program that we've gathered.
Okay.
Yeah. Madam Chair, I'll be, just for a second, lack of time, I went through the charts. My biggest question out of this whole section is, we didn't, it looks like $18 billion of the work and only, $500 or $600 million left over applicants that have been unfunded at this point. And I'm just wondering from the staff's perspective, as we build all these new campuses, we've had a very robust building cycle here, let's face it, in the last decade. As we look toward the 2014, are we leaning more toward still expanding with our declining population, or putting more money into this type of program of modernizing and rehabbing, the global 30,000-foot level look versus each one of these maps of how much goes in each thing? I mean, I can read the numbers there. I'm just wondering, since we built so many new campuses and a lot of new construction in the last decade, I mean, it's the largest build-out we've ever had in the state, are we going to be, do we think we should be shifting focus now toward maintaining, or we still see a lot of demographic changes and migration?
Well, the Department of Finance estimates that there are going to be far fewer numbers of students in terms of what, compared to what the need that we've just met. We still are going to have, their figures show Inland Empire, San Bernardino, Kern, Tulare, Madeira, Mariposa, up the valley. Those are going to still be growth areas. We have declining enrollment in urban core areas like Los Angeles, but there'll still be growth in those core areas of California. And you make a really good point, though, that the modernization needs are definitely still out there. So I think it's going to be a balance, probably not quite as much new construction as we look ahead, because we've got not as sharp an increase as being forecast.
But you also have an inventory of existing facilities as well. So
yeah, the problem is matching where the students are.
Right.
With where the facilities are,
Right.
Because you can't fly a kid to school every day,
Right. Right.
I think it's going to be another, when we get into the real discussions, because we've got to decide what is our criteria. Should every kid be able to be housed in a classroom? Is that our first criteria, that we have space for them? Is our second criteria that the classroom's adequate? Is our third? They're all different, they're all different things we have to figure out how we prioritize as a board in terms of where the money is going to be spent, especially given that even if we go forward with the 2014 bond, which I'm still assuming or hoping we will, we may not be going every 2 years like we did before. So we've got to take a look at the program, I think.
Yeah, and then the counterpoint to that, as people migrate from the inner core areas to the more suburban areas, there's assets there not being utilized. Do we mothball them? Do we sell them? Do we lease them? Do we regain some of the capital we put into them so we go forward the migration shift? And we brought it up several times, but we probably has been another thing on your list of things to look at.
That is another thing to look at, and I on the one hand agree, and on the other hand, I also remember the time in the 80s when many of the school districts were selling their properties only to find out less than a decade later that their enrollment was coming back up, and then they were having to pay much more than they sold them for to acquire new schools. So I don't know what the answers are, but I do think there's lots to discuss. So you want to walk us through some of these graphics?
Sure. Just briefly, it represents the over 6,300 applications for modernization that were approved by the board, the funded and the unfunded, as of December 15th. And it includes the entire state contribution, even if it's financial hardship, so it's not just the traditional state match. And on page 27, it uses the same data set as the other chart, and this talks about classrooms, what's on the funded and unfunded list, and that gets back to what we were talking about just a few minutes ago, which is what's the difference between the eligibility and the funding. So this is when a district submits an application, it indicates the number of classrooms that are going to be touched. So it doesn't mean that they're completely modernized, but just how many of the districts said we're touching on this particular project.
And is there any way of giving us this information in the future that would, you can look up at the top and it doesn't look like we modernized very many, but we know that is not a dense population area at all in the state. So is there any way of giving this to us based on a percentage of the pupil enrollment in those areas so that we know, kind of can compare the effort?
I have the exact same comment. I think that in order to really evaluate this is how many students are in these areas, because, and then you can not evaluate it, but then you can see relatively
Effort, yeah.
what's being done, and I think that's true also on your
Right.
page 31
Right.
as well. So you get some balance of what does the number possibly mean.
But I think there's probably one qualifier to the pupil population base. It may be, you may be getting information on today's numbers versus what historically has happened
Right.
through the life cycle of the program. So that's just a
Sure.
little qualifier there. I just want to
Sure.
throw out there.
It just gives you some relative.
Yeah.
I think it's not how we fund.
Right.
All right. I don't want to cut this short, but maybe we can move on to the project information worksheet. Since we've got, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Right.
Sure. Love to move on to the project
Great.
information
Good. We're
worksheet.
on the same page then.
Yes, on page 33.
Oh, by the way, before we move on, I apologize. Is there any public comment on this? I won't make you wait till the very end, so.
Good afternoon. My name is Kathy Allen. I'm the Senior Director of Facilities and Planning for the San Juan Unified School District here in Sacramento County, and also serve as Chair of CASH. Thank you for the opportunity to allow me to share some thoughts with the committee as we try to improve the state building program for the foreseeable future, hopefully in conjunction with the 2014 bond measure. A little history about my district. We have over 70 sites. The newest school was built in 1994. The oldest school is over 100 years old. The majority of my schools are over 50 years old. We've accomplished 60 modernization projects under the former lease purchase program, and then about 58 projects have been done under the current facility program. And then this does not include all the projects that were done, currently about 58 under SFP. It does not include all the projects done by the district with local funding, which is the position we've been in for many years. As you know, many groups and entities have been delving into the current program and identifying areas that appear to work well, those that don't, areas that may need to be tweaked or perhaps eliminated altogether. As we move forward with this process, one of my main concerns is that we all recognize that introducing changes to the program and implementing them is an exhaustive process and involves the efforts of many people over many weeks and months and sometimes years. It is imperative that we give ourselves the opportunity to fully analyze the effects of any proposed changes to our school districts, county offices, and the state agencies involved in the various approval processes. Equally important is to recognize how a new program will affect the financial status of the state and the school districts that may or may not have local funding. And finally, we do understand and have heard the concerns from you and other members of the legislature regarding components of the program, and will continue to work with you to find solutions that address your needs. I believe it is important to acknowledge the hard work completed by Dr. Jeff Vincent and his staff at the Center for Cities and Schools, with a nod to the emphasis placed on the state's existing inventory, and we've been spending a little bit of time talking about that today. With that in mind, any changes made to the modernization program in particular should be made with an eye toward not only preserving the billions of dollars in building inventory already on the ground, but also how can we best utilize these same buildings to accommodate the need for an ever-changing educational environment, especially in the area of technology. Program changes to a building to meet current educational delivery models cannot be accomplished through the state program as it sits today. By the time we fix accessibility issues and fire, life, and safety issues, I've burned through my state funding. If I'm lucky, I might have enough local funding to fix the roof, replace the HVAC, maybe replace single-pane windows with dual-pane and throw a new coat of paint on it. I haven't come close to truly renovating a classroom to meet the educational needs of today's K-12 kids. During a recent conversation with some CASH board members, I heard a comment that really made me pause. I'd like to kind of share it with you. When we undertake a modernization project in our effort to fix what needs fixing or upgrade what needs to be due to regulation, in doing so, we frequently have to demolish major components of the building. So in a sense, we are modernizing and building new at the same time, all under one program, the modernization program. We have a huge investment on the ground. There have been substantial changes over the years, not only in educational delivery, but building products, construction delivery methods, green technology, and technology in general. While some of these changes have led to safer buildings and energy efficiencies and technology enhancements, they are expensive. Deferred maintenance budgets have been essentially eliminated, and we struggle to find ways to protect what's inside the classroom. The current method of calculating modernization eligibility just doesn't work anymore. The funding from whatever source should be based on need, including educational program needs, not just the age of the building. I'm sure you'll hear many interesting ideas on what a new school program should look like. These will be very challenging issues with competing interests. The goal in my mind is to develop a program that meets our needs, doesn't bankrupt the state or local districts, but keeps the needs of children at the forefront. If we do this right, we won't be back here in 5 years doing it again. So thank you for your time. I look forward to working with you.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Joe Dixon, Assistant Superintendent Facilities, Santa Ana Unified School District. I hope we passed out a little document. What it is, I put together what I thought were 8 essential questions on modernization. And if I could, real quick, just looking at the chart in the middle, are examples of 6 of the 34 modernizations in Santa Ana Unified School District. If we look at the first one, Fremont Elementary School, and then you go down a couple to Hoover Elementary School and Wilson Elementary School, each of those schools have the playground on the roof. It's an urban district, obviously, Santa Ana, and space is at a premium. What the modernization, and they were open classroom floor plans, what the modernization couldn't do was fix the roof. We did fix it under the emergency repair program. We haven't been funded for it, but we went ahead and we funded that separately. When you look at technology for all the schools, actually the technology in the classroom, we use E-rate, the federal program for that. So we're being as creative as possible. Some of the things that we couldn't do that DSA would require us to do if it was within the scope was in these open classroom schools, you have to come up with fire-rated corridors and exiting, but if you're not touching it, you don't have to. We simply didn't have the money to do that. So we exhausted our modernization at those schools, and we haven't got to the new codes, really, is where we're at. If we look at Santa Ana High School, Santa Ana High School was built in 1937. There's other buildings there, too. We did not modernize 3 of the buildings. We were fortunate, I will say, to get an overcrowding relief grant there and replace the portables with a 2-story classroom. But Santa Ana High School, we did the public address system, the fire alarm, and the electrical upgrades, close to $9 million, again with emergency repair program money, but we haven't been funded for it. But we budgeted that off to the side and used our local bond for that. So I think what it shows is somehow, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, we need to figure out a way to modernize schools. Maybe you look at the different components of modernization and fund them. We look at the Center for City and School Study, as Kathy mentioned, and we take a look at some of the components in there, and we figure out what's the best way to provide safe schools, that also meet the educational needs of the kids. So that, thank you.
I have a question here.
So I just, a question on your chart, just to understand it. Are these things in parentheses where it says unfunded scope library upgrades? Does that mean that library upgrades were not done at that site?
Correct. If it's in red in parentheses, we did not do it.
I don't have color.
Oh, you don't have color? In parentheses, we did not do it.
So if it says unfunded, you did not do it?
Correct.
Okay. And in the X in technology, does that mean it got done?
Yes.
Okay.
But it wasn't done with modernization. It was done with E-rate. E-rate for Santa Ana, we get 90% of the cost through E-rate.
So this is the question that I struggle with. I ultimately, I believe local boards need to make decisions about their schools. They need to make decisions. When I was on the board, we decided which ones were in greatest need of modernization or upgrades or whatever, and we prioritized that. I don't think the state should be doing that. That's a decision that I hope you are doing in conjunction with your parent community and your school board.
Right. Which we are.
There's not unlimited resources here, either locally or at the state. And, what I hear you asking for is for the state to, give more money for items that some was necessary, whatever, based on, and that's a good goal. But facilities historically have been the responsibility of local communities, not the state at all. And as you ended up through a series of laws and actions or propositions and stuff that passed, we went from taking away all ability for local schools to pass bonds to the 2/3 requirement, and eventually coming up with the program we have that may be inadequate, but it's worked better than any other program that we've had that I can think of. I can understand what you're asking for and why you'd like more from the grants. What I ask you to go back and think about between now and when we have some of the bigger discussions is, if we have limited resources, the question is going to be, how much can the state give, but how also can we empower you to get your local community to support these changes that you need? Because I don't think the state's going to be able to say, that you've got an unlimited pot for modernization. I think ultimately, communities are going to get the quality schools that their communities are willing to fund. And my hope is, based on the message in the governor's budget, that we're not going to do away with this program at all, that it's going to continue, because I think it's a vitally important program and helps us pass bonds by allowing you to say we can leverage this money with state funding. But I'm right now not seeing the path for the state just to give you the money you need for all these things that are important. Some of them are critical, some of them are nice to have, but I don't know what the right path is here. But I do think we have to consider the ideal situation that we would like, and what are the minimum requirements that we have here.
I was going to piggyback on that, because I was going to ask you the same questions. From my understanding of this board and this procedure, was more to kind of spread out the new growth, and then to make everyone happy was, okay, let's put some money into old investments as well. But traditionally, that's always been the school district. And I've seen in my local ones and other, more and more money being taken out of that to go to day-to-day operations. And that's frankly a choice the school board has the right to make with their negotiations with their staff and everybody else. And now we're going to be on the hook to do 30-year bond money on stuff that frankly doesn't last 30 years. I think it's a wrong formula, and it's a way we're going more and more central government taking care of everything versus allowing the individuals to try to take care of themselves. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, what should, I'm looking at this as being almost a safety net and a way to redistribute growth of the state into areas that traditionally don't have schools. The modernization has been a point where, you heard me talking earlier, I don't want to see 3 buildings out of 5 being done, but at the same time it should be the basic, this the safety net. But I don't want to ever see the schools get there. Why don't we have enough resources, with the money that we're generating? If you look at the percentage of how much was going to, and it's not for lack of funding is going up, maybe it's not as dramatically as it used to be, but we are spending a lot more percentage on our operations and overhead and personnel than we ever have in the historical this state on schools. And that's frankly a choice, like I said, the school boards are making and the negotiations we're making. I'm just trying to figure out, where is that end, and are we going to be responsible for all facilities?
Maybe just a couple of comments. I'm not here to say give me more money. I mean, yes, it'd be great, but I realize that's unrealistic. You mentioned the path to get from point A to point B, and maybe what I kind of focused on, what you said was, maybe we could work on removing some of the obstacles that are in that path. And I'd have to think about, what those major obstacles are.
That's what I'm asking you to do, is because we can say the grant amounts are inadequate. Maybe we're going to be able to increase them, maybe we're not. how do we help you in terms of whether it's local bonds or whatever, being able to come up with more local resources. I do realize, I understand what Senator Hagman's saying, but I do realize we're also 49th in the nation in how we're funding. And when you've got the largest class sizes, the fewest numbers of librarians, counselors, and everything else, school boards make very.
But we also have the highest paid teachers by 30% of the state in the nation, and that's a choice we're making locally, and that is a choice.
We could get into a long discussion there, but let's stick with facilities because that's another.
So maybe one more just observation from my perspective. I mean, I have a school right now that really just needs to be raised. I mean, if I touch anything on that campus, it triggers so many mandates that there's no point in spending any money on that campus. So there's got to be another way for me to go on there and do something. Does it make sense to demolish it and build new? Maybe. That's a conversation we'll have to have. But when a school site comes to me and says, we've raised enough money to do blank, and I say, well, that's fantastic, but doing blank now triggers A, B, and C, and D, and your project just went from, $20,000 to $250,000, that's kind of frustrating. So
I've been there as a school board member, and believe me, what I really would like you to do is help educate us on what you believe the obstacles are and whether or not there's any way we can help you with that.
Okay.
Either through the State Allocations Board or legislatively, so that we can have some common sense solutions here and ways to move forward.
All right.
Can I real quick? I do have to say that Santa Ana Unified School District is pleased with the school facility program that we've been through with critically overcrowded schools and overcrowded relief grant and modernization. But the question is, are you able to do everything? And all I was trying to point out is no, we can't do everything that needs to be done. And as far as 30-year money for items that don't last 30 years, most districts are very cautious about that. And, there's examples where they're not, but we struggle with that as well. But do we have to buy, if we're putting in technology in a classroom, a smart board and projectors, shouldn't we also buy the computer that goes with it that isn't a 30-year piece of equipment? So we struggle with that, but I think we all we're doing a pretty good job at that. Yeah. It's just, there's some bad examples.
I think you're doing a great job. I would rather make sure the roof doesn't leak before I bought a smart board, though.
I think the conversation we're having actually is, though, one of what is the state's role, which is a fundamental question, I believe, and certainly there's going to be opinions around what is the state role. The state has had a significant role in funding schools. We've been 60% of modernization projects, regardless of what you think, how far that went. We were 50% of modernization projects. We were 50% of overcrowded. We've had a significant role in funding projects over the last 12 years, and school districts have relied upon that. They have structured their local bonds. They have moved forward in partnership. There was the developer fee component of this program as well. So I think that if we are going to talk about what is the state's role, that will be robust. And right now, where we are is we've had a significant role. There is the issues of regulations, of flexibility, of requirements, and that all plays into that. If we're looking at a state that says, on the operational side, which we have recently said, the discussions are around great flexibility with the funding, with accountable outcomes. So how do you get to the outcome? Accountability is how you work your funding, and whether that's something that we look at on the capital side is also, I think, could be part of the discussion. And from the Department of Education's belief, the outcome should be an enhanced educational environment. And we know the significance that has on the impact on student learning. So it's not, just make this building functional. It's the enhanced educational environment that we all are going to benefit from, because we'll have higher achieving students, we'll have greater retention of staff, and we can address the educational needs in California. So we continue to build the foundation here, which I think is just excellent material that the Office of Public School Construction provides on what's the foundation of what we're doing. But a lot of our discussions leaps on to what do we think the future should be, and it's hard to differentiate the two.
Well, I think it's good to have these conversations even now, because we create our bucket list and they'll come back, and I'm sure we'll come up with more. And I do agree. I mean, we want to provide the best educational experience possible. The question is how do you split up the funding responsibility for that? So, and with that, hopefully we can get through. I know we were supposed to go to like 4. All of you, can we stick around for at least can we go over the PIW at a high level? If it's going to be a really long, in-depth discussion, we can continue it at the next meeting. But are you okay? What? 5 or 10 minutes. Are you okay on time? All right. Let's.
The project information worksheet was approved by the board in September of 2007. It's been collecting data on new construction projects. In 2010, it was revised to start collecting information about the high performance grant. So those would be the few modernization projects that it captures. But basically, it's those that use the new construction pupil grants. And districts submit it 3 times. First, when the state funds are released, along with their application. Then when the first expenditure report is due, which is a year later, and then they submit a final one. They keep revising it for the same project when the final expenditure report is submitted. So the board directed staff to look at reducing the number of submittals, streamlining the worksheet, and also to explore expanding it to other programs. As far as streamlining it, we've streamlined the online worksheet. Things that we can do administratively by autofilling information that we already have as soon as the district enters the application number. Reducing the number of submittals would have to be done through the regulation process, so we have options, pros and cons. There's 3 of them, and the board would have to make a decision on that. As far as expanding it to other programs, these things were discussed at the implementation committee, and the current worksheet was designed specifically for new construction type projects. And as we've just been talking about, very different project scopes, modernization versus new construction. So we didn't see a way to just say, okay, here's a mod project, go ahead and fill it out. We would need something different. So attachment A, which is on page 35, is OPSE's sort of first draft, some of our concepts. It was presented in flow charts and just for discussion purposes, but basically it was a building by building approach. Districts would fill out the type of facility, admin, classroom, the type of work, what was done to the classroom or to the building, how old it is it permanent, modular, portable, and would there be additional work necessary for the district considered it fully modernized. Then there's another section with the box with the yellow boxes in it. If the building was completely replaced, we would gather information. What did you have? Why did you replace it? And what is there now?
Can I interrupt you 1 second? This is the form that everyone complains takes too much to fill out.
Right.
And you submit it 3 times, so that's current reg?
Yes.
And that's over a 3 or possibly 4-year period. When do you start? In the middle? And that's what the complaint's about?
Yes, that's correct.
I'd love to hear why from someone who wants to complain about it right now.
Well, I just want to try and gear this to how much time we all have, so they're just not talking to Kathleen and I. So, you're fine. Okay. Well.
And then if we turn to page 37, after several months of discussing with the implementation committee, we have something that's I wouldn't say that consensus was reached by any means, but it's much more high level. It's not per building, but rather per type of work. For example, what was done, we replaced a building, or hazardous materials were abated. Assuming there would only be 2 submittals, what was the cost of that work for the entire campus, and what was the cost of that work, the actual cost for at the second submittal. And then over on the right, we would simply capture what type of facilities were modernized or were touched, and how many of them. And in the bottom right would be the total square foot. So we wouldn't know per building, but we would know the complete permanent, modular, and portable square footage that was modernized as part of that project. And then also the cost per square foot, just in the aggregate.
But the big chart is for, combines all types.
Yes, it doesn't differentiate between permanent, modular, portable, or how much of a square footage what was done, just the cost. So those are the primary concepts between the 2 proposed pages that would capture modernization.
Bill, you've been really involved in this. Do you have comments?
Yeah, we reviewed this over the last year at the Implementation Committee of the Allocation Board, and we heard a lot of concerns, Mr. Agman, from districts regarding the amount of time to fill out the reports. There's a bunch of issues. One of them is many times at school districts, the people filling out the reports are an accountant in the district office or someone who may not have project knowledge, so there's sometimes a disconnect there. We heard concerns about how the data was going to be used. We heard concerns about adding some additional requirements at the end of the program. The money's all gone. You're going to have us do more work with the modernization. So I just wanted to characterize that. The original use of the project information worksheet was to actually inform the discussion about how much it costs to build a school. And the most fundamental piece of data that we gathered that the state doesn't have anywhere else and doesn't get from any other source is the district tells, what did I actually spend, the whole project, on this project, and the state never collects that data in that way, and it's formatted by soft costs and hard costs. So in the previous allocation boards back in the day, I'm not sure if Ms. Moore was there or not, but there were some pretty rancorous discussions regarding the grant adequacy and based upon analysis of the data, and I think everyone's kind of shied away from looking at it. But the reality of the PIW is that the data regarding costs is something that we don't get anywhere else, and we really need, but we don't talk about either. So that's just one piece. So as we go forward, I think most districts probably want to, if I can represent the stakeholders that came to the IMP committee, they probably want a form that's pretty concise, that's easy to fill out, that doesn't ask for data that we already have at the state. And I think OPSC has done a great job in the last process of saying, gee, we actually already had a bunch of data that we were asking you for. We'll auto-populate that now, and that's really been a good process. And I think districts want to understand, how will the data be used? Will we ever look at costs? And when we look at the sheets that you're looking at here, these proposed modernization sheets, part of our overall discussion, I think, in the program needs to be, can we establish a database of our facilities, and then this information feeds into that. And so this is a step that's key in getting information about what we do, but we also need to have an inventory of some kind that this kind of plugs into, and that's, I guess, what I wanted to say. Thanks.
It seems to me that creating that inventory is probably a monumental task.
It is, and it's probably a local task to be.
Well, and that, you know, so I don't know to what extent that's, if you've got to do that before you get the information, you might as well not have the project. Because I think trying to get people locally, I mean, you could say, well, they'll participate in the program or whatever, but it's probably a huge task that I don't know how realistic it is. It's a great ideal, I mean, but you also have to start somewhere, you know, and when we get more complaints about the inadequacy of the modernization grants and what we can't do and what we should be doing and everything else, than pretty much any other program that we have, and yet there's no data to let us know what's really happening. I mean, any of us can pick out isolated schools to say this is all we were able to do, but there are other schools where they are doing significantly more than that. And, you know, I think if we're going to make decisions and we're going to change a program, ultimately they need to be data-driven decisions. And so, you know, I'm not ready right now to say these are the exact forms, but I don't think it's unreasonable to say we should be collecting some modernization data. We've got to have that. I do believe, though, that you started out with the new program. You know, the one thing that's come loud and clear to me over the little over a year plus or so that I've been on this board is that, you know, people like to follow the rules that have been in place. We're at the point where we're not allocating out, we're just about done allocating out money, and so now to tell them after they have the money and they're in the middle of their projects that whoops, we're going to have to do this, I think that's going to be a little tough to swallow. But I do believe that moving forward with a new program is a time that we ought to be taking a look at how do we collect data in an efficient manner that doesn't overburden anyone, but that can give us some valuable information on what we're able to do with the dollars that we allocate and the dollars that the schools have, and have some idea then of the adequacy.
Well, I agree with you. And I think when we move forward in the new program, data-driven decisions are important. We ask our school districts to make data-driven decisions all the time. And so I think we'll have a good discussion on that and what that inventory, if it's an inventory or others, pieces of that, what are the data points that are important, and how can we better serve, I mean, again, the ultimate end of how do we distribute limited resources, and then how do we ensure that we are truly investing in students' education. So I look forward to that.
I would just ask one thing. If we do put off any kind of changes until the funding runs out, we get the new cycle, which is 2 or 3 years away, is there enough data that we have right now consistently to make all the informed decisions we have to do to put a new bond up? That's the question I have. If you don't start putting this in now, the real basic factors, how much a square foot is it costing this, those type of things, and you want to have that robust discussion about how much we should be doing, or if there's a new way to fund a modernization project, do we have the data now, or should we try to capture the data that we have and the project's ongoing so we can make informed decisions before we decide what we're going to do?
The only data that we do have is what we fund, which again is based on the plans that have been approved by the Division of State Architect. It does not reflect what was actually constructed, was actually built at the end of the project, which we understand can be substantially different.
Which is basically no data.
Right.
That's nothing for me as a contractor, my 30 years of family contracting, to figure out what the heck to do in the future. So I think you do put something like this forward. I don't think it's too much to ask for the hundreds of millions of dollars that's going out to projects up and down the state to fill out 2 forms to figure out something. So when we come back and I have to give a good conscious vote on a bond I want to put out for their benefit, and, you know, to build the schools and stuff, that we have some data to base it on.
Well, they're filling it out on new construction now. The question is how do we apply it to modernization? And one of the questions we can't answer even in this is, what do you want versus what are you doing? You know, so.
Well, but most campuses, I mean, what you're saying from a lot of campuses, they are backfilling with their own funds to make their projects get to their levels.
Yeah.
So if they sit there and say, you know, that ends up being 30% of what they're getting from us, or it's 20%, or, you know, whatever the case may be, that will give us at least a little better understanding. And what are they getting for that? It's going to be hard. I mean, I think the new construction is pretty straightforward. You get a piece of land, you build it, you put the modern cost in there. This is the most complicated part of what we do here, is to figure out at what point do we ditch the building and build a new one. You know, if it's 60 years old versus 30 years old or 100 years old, there's going to be a lot of difference on the infrastructure, all the rest of it. That's the data that we need right now to figure out if we're going to do a new system versus a per pupil grant. You're going to have that data. So I don't know how you do without it.
Let me suggest this. Maybe, I know in the one hand it'd be nice to wrap this up, but maybe we could leave this as an unfinished item for the next agenda, and you can think about some of these comments, and those of you who are in the audience can think about that as well. And, sometimes you make decision based on really good data, and sometimes you have to make decisions based on imperfect data. But, or no data. That happens, but, and sometimes all we can do is move forward in a way that is positive and an improvement.
So we'll table it for the next meeting.
Yeah, is that okay? Yeah, is there any public comment, or, yeah? All right, well then, we're adjourned, and...
Thank you.
What's our next date?
February?
February 5th, right?
Right.